Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to my Spec Spotlight for the Havoc Demon Hunter. Since the first video in this series on the Shadow Priest went over pretty well, I'm going to try and make one of these videos per week. A Spec Spotlight where we just take a look at the spec and what it brings in a Mythic Plus keystone type setting. So let's get started by taking a look at Havoc's damage profile. Havoc Demon Hunter does really good damage at pretty much any number of targets, but as far as their damage profile goes, I'd place them a little bit more on the AoE side of the spectrum. Because they do scale really nicely into big pulls as well, just with their death sweeps and eye beams doing huge amounts of damage. Their damage is a little bit more bursty than sustained. It comes a little more in, a small window of time while they're in their meta coming out of their eye beam. But they do consistent good damage, and those burst windows are fairly frequent. So I'm going to place them in the mid ground, but a little bit more towards the bursty side of the spectrum. Now, when you think of Havoc Demon Hunters, you might think of them as one of the most cooldown dependent specs, because Metamorphosis is such an impactful cooldown, and it's on such a long cooldown, 4 minutes, one of the longest cooldowns that a spec has for their main damage cooldown. But Havoc Demon Hunter does pretty good damage outside of their cooldown as well. When their Metamorphosis isn't up, they are still often competitive. So I'm placing them roughly in the middle of this spectrum, but it is worth noting that Metamorphosis is a big cooldown that they do have. Then finally, when we think about their damage, whether it's on demand or whether it takes some time to ramp up, Havoc Demon Hunter is one of the most on-demand damage specs in the game. They just press their eye beam and they're going. There's no requirement to really set stuff up. Yeah, they need a little bit of fury or whatever, but it's pretty much instantly there. Right at the start of a pull, Havoc Demon Hunters are doing their damage. This can even be a problem on weeks like Skittish Week. You may need to be a little bit careful of your Havoc Demon Hunter just ripping threat right at the start of a pull on Skittish Week, and they may need to, in fact, hold their eye beam for a little bit for your tank to build some threat. All right, let's talk a little bit about the utility that Havoc Demon Hunter brings. Chief among the utility they have, I'd say, is Imprison. Imprison is a hard CC that works on pretty much anything, and one special thing about Imprison, compared to most other forms of crowd control, is that if you imprison a mob that's out of combat, you will not get in combat with it if you walk next to it. This is true only for Imprison and Sap. Every other form of cooldown of crowd control does not work this way. So Imprison is uniquely powerful this way. If you have a rogue and a demon hunter, there are a lot of spots where you can just, Sap Imprison two things and walk right on by them and not get in combat. Whereas if you didn't have the DH rogue combo, you'd have a lot more problems where you actually had to, find some way to drop combat with them or just actually kill them. So big piece of utility coming out of Havoc Demon Hunters. Also great against bolstering, because mobs that are imprisoned will not get bolstered on. And that is, a bigger... That's not true of things like Polymorph or, Freezing Trap, all the other CCs that are in the game. Havoc Demon Hunters also increase the entire magic damage of your group by 5% with the Chaos brand that they apply to everything that they do damage to. This is pretty useful in some groups. In some groups, it doesn't matter all that much. If you're playing with Outlaw Rogues, Prot Warriors, and stuff, that's not going to be huge parts of their damage that it affects. But if you're playing with specs like Fire Mage, they're going to get huge amounts of extra damage from your Chaos brand. I guess they're going to get 5% extra damage from your Chaos brand, which is not zero, and that damage doesn't show up on the Havoc Demon Hunter on the meters, but it is brought by the Havoc Demon Hunter effectively. Havoc Demon Hunters also have an offensive purge, which is useful in several dungeons, and they have the ability to taunt. And this comes up in some places. A lot of specs have the ability to taunt, but Havoc Demon Hunters in particular have a lot of ways to taunt and then not die. They have a lot of mobility after they taunt, so they can kite if they need to. So this is useful if you're taunting a boss on Necrotic, for instance. And they have a suite of defensive options that they can combine with their taunt to allow them to survive abilities and maybe make it so that your tank also gets to survive when they otherwise wouldn't. Chief among those defensive abilities is Netherwalk. Netherwalk is something that they can talent, so they won't always have access to this. It's on the same row as something that gives them a lot of leech, which they may take if they don't feel like they need Netherwalk for a particular dungeon. But the combination of Taunt Netherwalk, Taunt plus Immunity is a big, powerful combo that can take, a Wasting Strike from Lord Waycrest or a Blade combo from King Dazar and just remove it from the, the calculus for a while. It can make it so your tank, when they don't have a cooldown for something, they can call for that Netherwalk taunt and live. Or on tyrannical necrotic environments, this can allow them to tank a boss for a little bit while the tank drops stacks of necrotic, and that is hugely useful. They also have Blade Dance. Now, Blade Dance is a rotational button. It's part of their damage rotation that they should press off cooldown to do the maximum possible damage. But there are also situations where it can be used to take advantage of the fact that you dodge 100% of things coming at you while you're blade dancing. King's Rest, for example, is full of bleeds that can be blade danced. Severing Axe from Kula the Butcher, and the bleeds from the berserkers on the bridge, the spectral berserkers. Those can be blade danced if a Demon Hunter knows what they're doing. It's a pretty tight window, right? The blade dance only lasts for a second, so it needs to be pretty well timed. But there are spots where this can be very useful, and there are even spots where you can taunt blade dance specific dodgeable boss abilities. Again, this is a high skill maneuver, not something that you would expect to see in like a weekly 10 or a 15 group or whatever, but as you start pushing up higher than that, you might start running into Demon Hunters that are going to try and do this, or you might be able to, tell them to try and do this, and this can be a really useful thing when it does come up. Demon Hunters are also just naturally tanky, even when they're not tanking things, just against other forms of damage incoming at them. They have a lot of leech, naturally, and they take reduced magic damage from the tattoos that are on them, and they have Blur, which is a nice, powerful defensive, and it's on a fairly short cooldown, so they have a pretty good ability to survive, damage like Tantrum on Kragmaw, or just big AoE damage that's coming out from some of these bosses. Galvez, for instance, Havoc Demon Hunters on that fight are really nice because they'll require a lot less healing than everybody else, so they can soak just pretty much every time their stacks drop and heal themselves to full, which is really useful on that fight because it's such a high HPS check otherwise. Okay, now one little known thing about Havoc Demon Hunters is that they actually also have another immunity, and this one is this is a really special kind of immunity. It's the meta immunity. So the way this works is that during the 1 second while you are in the air in your meta leap, like when you press meta, you leap through the air. While you are in the air there, you are immune to most things. So there are cases in Mythic Plus where you can use this to immune abilities. For instance, on Lord Stormsong, when he casts Ancient Mindbender, if you meta and you're in the air when the Ancient Mindbender cast finishes and it tries to target you, instead nothing will happen, you won't get mind controlled. You can do this, there are a bunch of abilities, like if you get targeted with Spit Gold, for instance, on the first boss of King's Rest, and you meta right as the Spit Gold is coming at you, again, nothing's going to happen, you're going to immune it. So this is a cool little trick. One thing that is a problem with it is, of course, meta is on a very long cooldown, and it's one of your offensive buttons, so it's tough to know when you should hold it versus when you just use it. And that will depend on the keystone level and how important it is to dodge the effect that's coming at you. Demon Hunters also bring a lot of ways to interact with mobs in a pull. In addition to having Imprison, if you're not using Imprison for CC, you can use it as a pseudo interrupt. They have an AoE stun in Chaos Nova. You may see your Demon Hunters just kind of firing off this AoE stun on cooldown. That'll be because it has an interaction with one of their traits where when they AoE stun, they'll get these little soul fragments that'll help reduce the cooldown of their I-beam. So you may see them using this not for utility, but just for reducing the cooldown on that I-beam on big pulls. But they also can use this for utility, and that's pretty nice when it does happen. One thing that does not get used a lot by Demon Hunters, but can be, and should be, more often perhaps, is that they have an AoE slow. They have a very powerful slow, a very powerful 70% 3-second slow, attached to their Vengeful Retreat. So when your tank is kiting, if you have a composition that doesn't really slow things, if you're lacking that like Frost Mage or Assassination Rogue or whatever to put a heavy slow on all the targets in the pack, your Demon Hunter can run into the middle of the pack and Vengeful Retreat out of it, and that will slow all the mobs in it by a pretty substantial amount, and that can help your tank, if they're trying to run away from a big bolstered thing or they're trying to drop necrotic stacks again. This is a useful thing to have in your arsenal. Havoc Demon Hunters also bring Darkness. Darkness is a little bit less useful in dungeons than it is in raids. In raids, it's a very potent AoE cooldown. In dungeons, it's most useful against specific affixes. Like, it's pretty good against bursting, because bursting is, pretty high damage ticks that are not like one-shots in and of themselves, and there will be a lot of them that can all be covered by the same darkness. So darkness against, 20 ticks of bursting in a 5-second window is likely to maybe stop each person from taking 1 tick, and that can be pretty useful. But it's a little bit less useful against just like big bursts of AoE damage that happen from boss abilities or whatever, because, it might save 1 or 2 people from taking the damage, but that's not, it's not likely to actually save somebody's life in the same way that in raid, there's often abilities where this is a lot more likely to do that. Demon Hunters also have double jump and glide, so I'm going to call this parkour. They have the ability to do weird Demon Hunter skips and things. There are all kinds of weird dungeons and places where you can, as a Demon Hunter, like get through places without getting in combat with stuff, and it's kind of hard to know exactly where all these are, unless you like go into Mythic Zero and just jump around and see what you can do, or you watch like Evade stream. That guy knows most of these skips. He discovered a lot of them himself. Most of these aren't too important to know if you're a Demon Hunter, and most of them you shouldn't expect that a Demon Hunter in your group will know. I'd say the biggest one that we've discovered fairly recently is there's a way to skip the Shadow of Zool mini-boss. in King's Rest, which I made a video on that came out recently. So you may want to check that out if you haven't heard of this by using a Demon Hunter's double jump there. That may be fixed sometime soon, but as of right now, it is something that Demon Hunters can do with their double jump. But otherwise, there are spots where, a Demon Hunter can die, and instead of getting res, they can just release and do some cool parkour to get back to where the group is without getting in combat with all the mobs that were skipped on the way. That's something that does come up from time to time. And finally, Demon Hunters do have Spectral Sight. This comes up in a couple of dungeons. Tal Dazar, there's these two, there are some stealth mobs that you may want to pull at different times, or you may want to know where exactly they are. Temple of Citralis in the first boss room, there's a Shrouded Fang that patrols around that you may want to grab, or again, just know where it is. And Demon Hunters do have the ability to find those stealth mobs, which, is another piece of utility they have. All in all, a pretty heavy utility suite for Demon Hunters. A lot of these are niche uses or hard to execute uses that we were talking about, but it's a pretty cool spec because the basics of this spec are pretty easy to understand. The damage rotation is among the fewest buttons of any damage rotation in World of Warcraft. But there are all these little things you can do with these, 1 second dodge windows on Blade Dance or 1 second immunity windows on Metamorphosis that you can use to really, if you've mastered the spec, get even a little bit more mileage out of it. Let's talk about the builds of Havoc Demon Hunter that you're likely to encounter in keys. By far the most common major essence that you're likely to see is the essence of the Focusing Iris. In very high tyrannical keys, you may see Havoc Demon Hunters drop this essence for something more single target oriented. Something like Blood of the Enemy to be a little bit of a mid-ground between single target and AoE, or Crucible of Flame if they want to be much more single targety. But for the most part, in most key situations, Havoc Demon Hunters are usually going to run Essence of the Focusing Iris. It's their best AoE essence by quite a lot, and they can get a really fast cast time on it with all the haste that they have coming out of their I-beams, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The minors you're likely to see on Havoc Demon Hunters, generally you'll see some combination of Vision of Perfection, Purification Protocol, and Conflict and Strife. Of these, I'd say Vision and Purification Protocol is the more default thing that you'll see most of the time, but Conflict and Strife sometimes making its way in there. The Vision of Perfection, really nice because, again, Metamorphosis is such a long cooldown and such an impactful one that reducing it is a useful thing to do. And Purification Protocol, just a very high damage trait in any kind of AoE situation, which is most of Mythic Plus. As far as the Azurite traits you may want to be aware of that Demon Hunters run, usually they will play 2 or 3 copies of a trait called Furious Gaze. And what that does is that gives them a huge haste boost coming out of their I-beam. And that makes their damage even more bursty and even more focused around this I-beam window. And coming out of that while they play this talent that makes them into a Metamorphosis demon after their I-beam also. And so they'll be doing huge damage after their I-beam for like 10 seconds. And that is another thing that synergizes really nicely with the essence of the Focusing Iris we were talking about, because that huge amount of haste means that they can get through that Focusing Iris cast in a very short time, compared to how long it takes other specs to channel it up and down. They also play a trait called Eyes of Rage almost always. This trait is another thing that synergizes with I-beam. It increases the damage of it, but also it reduces the cooldown of I-beam every time they pick up a soul fragment. They'll play a talent that generates soul fragments sometimes just as part of their rotation, but also they'll generate soul fragments when things die or when they stun things with their Chaos Nova. So this is why when we were talking about Chaos Nova, sometimes you may see them firing off that Chaos Nova just on like 6 targets to generate some soul fragments. Finally, a trait that is very worth being aware of is Chaotic Transformation. Chaotic Transformation means that when they Metamorphosis, they will reset the cooldown on their I-beam and their Death Sweep. And what that means is that if you're playing with a Demon Hunter who has Chaotic Transformation, before the keystone starts, they will probably want to go I-beam, Metamorphosis, and then maybe even another I-beam, and then you start the key. And that way they'll start the dungeon with 40 seconds of Metamorphosis or whatever, and their Metamorphosis will be still available, will still be off cooldown. If you're playing with a Demon Hunter who did not have Chaotic Transformation, instead they'll just do I-beam and Metamorphosis, and they won't do 2 I-beams before the key starts. So with that being said, it's really worth noting that Demon Hunters generally will appreciate it if you have a countdown timer for the key so that they can get that Metamorphosis and then have its cooldown be reset as the keystone starts. Let's talk about synergies and tensions with Havoc Demon Hunter. Havoc Demon Hunter is in a very popular spot in the metagame right now. They slot pretty effectively into almost any group. They're almost as ubiquitous as rogues these days. As far as synergies goes, there's not really anything in particular that you need to make them better. One thing that you do get paid for is magic damage in your group, right? The Chaos Brand we were talking about, 5% extra magic damage. If you have a spec like a Balance Druid or a Fire Mage in your group, they're going to benefit from that. Otherwise, though, you're fine. Havoc Demon Hunter can slot pretty well these days into a composition that has no other magic damage. The magic damage buff is not a required part of Havoc Demon Hunter success. like it may have been in previous seasons. Because of that overall good position that Havoc Demon Hunter is in, their high overall damage numbers this patch, and the big amounts of utility they bring, I would say that there's not really any tensions that exist with the Havoc Demon Hunter spec. There's not really any compositions where you'd be looking and you'd be like, ooh, this is going to be tough for us with Havoc Demon Hunter. Nothing like that in the game right now. Thanks for watching this spec spotlight on the Havoc Demon Hunter. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video. If there's anything that I missed, of course, there's a chance that I have forgotten something. I try not to. I try to research these things as effectively as I can, but it does happen, so let me know there, and I'll pin any comments that have something really big that I've forgotten. Do also let me know which specs you'd like to see featured in upcoming spotlights, because I will be trying to make one of these every week or so. And I'm looking at your input. Havoc Demon Hunter was one that was often suggested on the last video, so that's why I decided to go with that. But any spec you like, we can do spotlights on. We can do them all. Anyways, remember to like and subscribe the channel. Turn on notifications as well. I'm supposed to say that. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.